future tasks. I'm not so sure I want to, this is just little things to ding us. We're just reminding ourselves that houses as modern as that home on the lower right are actually liable for historic listing at this point. That's a house built in 1950, and so it's 60 years old. It sort of reminds us that we're aging in place here, and that the little things that we thought were very modern are now historic, and modern can be historic. The other thing is, and we've talked about this before, but we haven't gone very far with it. We may need a little extra help from council should we get moving on it. But there are a couple of documents that talk to us about our town. And Great Good Country by Lillian Ottness is the most prescient one. The other one, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but there's a thing called Moscow at the Turn of the Century. And this was written by Homer David. And he just put this together, and we have a copy of it, and we think we should get this republished. It's in a nice little red binding, but I just have a photocopy of it. But so we're looking at doing that. And in that regard, I guess I would encourage somebody at this dais to think about writing something now. This was written in 1965 by Homer David. I know we've got our computer emails and all that, but it'd be okay if one of you decided in your thoughtful years to write down what's happened in Moscow in your lifetime. Gee, I'm looking at you, Tim. Wayne. You can.
Wayne.
I will say that
I
knew that was coming.
Homer David was one of the three David brothers that owned David's department store. The fourth brother taught at Harvard, I believe, in their business school. And so Earl David lived on Polk Street, Howard David lived on Polk, and Homer lived on B and thank you. Yeah.
So
great old historical family. So David's department store is where Champions is today.
Couldn't be any better than Brown's Furniture, could it?
I think Tim can write the next chapter.
All I'm doing is saying, should you know somebody who has a desire for writing, it's not too late to think about saying, what was life like at the turn of the century in Moscow? Because in another 50 years, people will look back and
talk about the turn of the century of 2000.
Yeah. The turn of the 21st century.
2000.
Well, you know about the other one too, don't you, Wayne?
You may not see the next one.
I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's don't talk about 2014 yet. Let's let that happen. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nels. Are you willing to field any questions if the council has any? Anybody? Walter?
Any volunteers?
Nels, what's the ramifications, pro and con, briefly, for expanding the historic district?
To be on the National Register of Historic Places is an honor that has no responsibility or no requirements. So that even though my house has been on the National Register since 1973, if I want to tear it down tomorrow, it's just up to me whether to tear it down or not. So I would assure everyone that being on the National Register there's no federal restrictions or attention to that. The only time that there are restrictions to being on the National Register is if you decide to get federal money, if the feds give you money. For instance, Reidenbaugh Hall, back in 1981 or 2, we put a new roof on Reidenbaugh Hall, and we got a grant from some federal agency. They told us what the shingles would be like. So there was a requirement. because we had federal money, but a private person or a business. Now, if you get tax benefits on Main Street for being on the National Register, then once again you have to pay a little attention to the rules. But if you don't do any of those things, there's nothing in the world that, so it's not an onerous thing, it's an honor. That's all. Does that help?
Yes, it does. And this is an area, not a single house
This
thing.
is an area.
You could have a house built there 2 years ago that would just happen to be inside the area
Right.
that's defined.
And as we looked at that, if we went back and looked at that area, there aren't many new houses in there. But what we would do with a consulting group is itemize all the houses that seem to they would be conforming to the idea of the district. Not every house would conform. I don't know how many. I think there's 150 or 160 houses in the current historic district. Only 116 of them are conforming. So contributing is a better, conforming isn't the right word. Contributing is the word. Same with downtown. We have 65 buildings in the downtown area, but only 32 of them are contributing to the historic district. You don't have to be contributing. If there was a really hyper-modern house built in this area, which certainly could happen and wouldn't hurt anybody, it probably wouldn't be contributing because it wouldn't be historic and it wouldn't be of that era. In other words, what happened, what was going on in the 20s and 30s and 40s, most of the houses in this area that we're looking at are pre-war. So there will come a time when we'll go to Indian Hills. They'll be old at some point in another 30 years, and we'll say, well, what were we doing in 1970? What were houses like that? But there's no sense that you would ever get your whole town. Only towns like Charleston are kind of have almost the whole town as a historic district. Most towns just have small areas. For some reason, the pride of place that the people had that were within that red area, it's hard to describe how prideful Moscow citizens were in 1890 and 1900 and 1910. And I don't want to belittle us, but I don't know if we're that proud. I'm not sure.
Sue, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, I just want to put a pitch in for extending north of D Street, because my old house was built in 1937 on a third of an acre. I think part of it was the large lot size that also made it seem like a sense of place. Because there are these setbacks in the homes.
But I think it's important for to hire somebody who does
That's
this
right.
as a profession and come in and
That's fine. I'm
give
just
us
putting my
some-
vote in for,
Yeah.
you're allowed to cross
But
D
we're,
Street.
you know, I'm anxious to just be aware of I think the treasure that we have in our town, which doesn't mean that people, you know, there will come a time when you're, I guess you've sold your house now, Tim, but that little area is special. You know, that was one of the first subdivisions that was made in Moscow, and there will come a time when somebody will want to deify that with a historic gesture, probably.
Wayne?
Trying to remember if we ever had the discussion when I was on the Historic Preservation Commission, and we were talking about expanding the Fort Russell District. Would you ever have the conversation about a minimal expansion of the actual Fort Russell District to homes such as yours and some that, the McConnell Mansion, for instance, that for some strange reason is not in it, and then going into a broader area and actually creating a different historical preservation or a historical district and naming it something different?
I believe that I'm going to just predict what could happen, and it might be me if I can hang around for a while to guide this, but we could have a historic district of our own just a Moscow Historic District on the other side of 6th, let's say between 6th and the highway. There's a lot of interesting homes over there that would relate to a particular district, and we could do that ourselves and just honor it as a Moscow place. It wouldn't be on the National Register necessarily, but it would be our Moscow district, and many cities do that.
Anyone else? Tom?
A few years ago, we had Larry Hodge make a presentation to the council.
I remember it. I
And
think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and he presented on the history of development on, I believe it was entirely on the east side of Mountain View.
Right.
And I wish, maybe we do have this videotaped, but I wish we had videotaped that presentation. I remember at the time thinking, oh, we're not videotaping this, but perhaps we did. Oh, we do?
I
think keeping that somewhere, that was an excellent presentation, and in 30 years, when those homes are 50 years old, it's going to be really nice to be able to see
I agree
that
with you. The
development.
the subdivisions east of Mountain View happen in unusual ways, and Larry was particularly insightful because he probably worked on most of those subdivisions, and so that's a perfect, I wish he, in a way, I'm sure he's living an exciting life in Portland, but if he were here, I'd work on him to try and write that a little better, because you're right, that's a really good a story that I think is meaningful, again, in a few years.
Please.
And just likewise, I used to live on Kenneth Street, and I think the name of that neighborhood was like Old Swedetown or something like that. There are lots of little clusters of, potentially, valuable historic districts with different names besides just Russell District. And I think, Fort Russell. So I think this is, what Wayne's getting to, that there are probably other pieces of Moscow that deserve some kind of discussion rather than just.
And we do need 2 new members. So if you have a cool idea of somebody that would like to be on the historic people of Moscow, listen to me. We need 2 members, and so we would be happy to accept a new couple. I have somebody that's a adjunct professor over at the university that we're talking to get on the. I think he wants to be on. So one of the things that we're working on that we're just starting is the possibility of having a historic district on the campus.
Oh, fun.
And we've talked to to President Burnett, and he seems willing to at least listen to the idea.
Great.
Thanks.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nels. Please convey our thanks to your fellow commissioners as well. Thanks, Mike. Good job.